Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a really widespread assumption. For years, there's been this pervasive belief across the globe that America was, without a doubt, winning the trade war against China. I mean, we've all seen the headlines, right? The heavy tariffs, the targeted sanctions, those sweeping advanced chip bans. It was all this immense economic pressure, carefully designed by Washington to slow China's momentum down. But while the entire world was captivated by those daily, high-stakes headlines, the data actually suggests a completely different story was unfolding in the background. Today, we're going to unpack the sources and see how China quietly pivoted, adapted to the pressure, and actually began rebuilding the architecture of the global economy right around itself.
And that brings us to the core of what we're looking at today. While we were all so heavily focused on the immediate geopolitical drama and the endless back and forth of tariff negotiations, the real foundation shifted entirely beneath our feet. We actually went from asking, can America stop China, to a much, much more uncomfortable reality. So the question now is, did China already win? Section 1, the trade war begins, spanning from 2018 to the present. Let's start by zooming in on the micro-level origins of this conflict.
The evolution of this dispute was incredibly rapid. If you think back to 2018, the trade war officially begins, starting with what honestly seemed like pretty isolated levies on things like solar panels and washing machines. But wow, by 2019, it had escalated dramatically. We saw hundreds of billions of dollars in sweeping tariffs applied to everyday goods, totally disrupting supply chains that had been entrenched for decades. And in the present day? Well, we're no longer just looking at a simple trade dispute over the price of steel or consumer electronics. We are looking at the emergence of a full-scale economic Cold War that literally touches nearly every major industry on the planet.
Now, to understand the present, we really have to revisit the spark. Washington leveled a heavy series of accusations at Beijing, basically stating that the global playing field was fundamentally broken. The United States specifically cited unfair trade practices, rampant intellectual property theft, deliberate currency manipulation, and coordinated industrial espionage. According to the sources, these distinct grievances were the catalyst. This is exactly what set the stage and provided the justification for those historic economy-shifting tariffs to be implemented in the very first place.
But this created a really fascinating paradox. Washington's expectation was that under the crushing, sudden weight of those tariffs, China's economy would, naturally crack. The assumption was that all this pressure would force a change in policy. But the reality? China adapted and actually accelerated. Instead of collapsing inward, Chinese companies aggressively expanded their manufacturing footprints. They essentially just moved their supply chains into neighboring regions like Southeast Asia and Mexico to bypass the tariffs. They built brand new trade alliances. And surprisingly enough, they actually increased their overall global exports.
Moving on to Section 2, Strategy for True Independence, Building a Parallel System. Now, what's really interesting here is the revelation that China's goal wasn't just to survive tariffs, but to achieve total independence. The strategy really evolved in 3 distinct phases. Step 1 was simple survival, just absorbing the initial shock of the tariffs and keeping the factories running. But Step 2, that's where the monumental pivot happened, preparing for Western tech and finance cutoffs. The sources suggest Beijing recognized a profound vulnerability. They realized the very real danger of U.S. dominance over massive systems like global semiconductors and the SWIFT financial network. So they shifted their entire national strategy to Step 3, building an entire parallel economic system. They wanted an ecosystem that could function completely independently, basically insulating themselves just in case they were ever fully cut off from the West.
To achieve this, Beijing unleashed some truly unprecedented capital allocation. I mean, they poured monumental funding directly into the foundations of tomorrow. We're talking artificial intelligence, the electric vehicles driving on your streets right now, domestic semiconductor production, absolute dominance in rare earth mining, advanced industrial automation, and massive shipping infrastructure. It's wild because while America was heavily focused on deploying sanctions and restricting access, China was focused entirely on building the physical and technological foundation for absolute self-sufficiency.
All right, Section 3, Shifting the Global Map, the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's zoom out to the global map for a second and see how this builds across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia.
Because you see, this wasn't just a domestic strategy. It was a massive physical expansion. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China financed immense global infrastructure to the tune of over $1 trillion.
We're talking about the physical arteries of global trade here, financing massive deep-water ports, laying down thousands of miles of railways and highways, erecting power plants, and building sprawling industrial zones. They physically and very methodically connected themselves to the emerging, resource-rich world. Now, as you might expect, this international financing sparked a highly polarized global debate. On one side, critics aggressively label this strategy as debt diplomacy. They argue that it deliberately traps developing nations under insurmountable loans, basically forcing them to hand over sovereign assets when they inevitably default. But on the flip side, supporters point to it as absolutely vital development, providing crucial, tangible infrastructure for emerging nations that, frankly, are frequently locked out of traditional Western funding mechanisms. But hey, regardless of the intense politics surrounding the initiative, the undeniable result is massive global leverage. By financing and building these critical projects, Beijing deeply and permanently connected itself to the very lifeblood of the global economy. They secured guaranteed flows of raw materials and created incredibly loyal trading partners. And that translates directly to unprecedented strategic leverage on the world stage, altering voting blocs in the UN and shifting global allegiances. Which brings us to Section 4, the decoupling paradox, America's biggest problem. So the crucial point here is the unexpected twist. America assumed the world would isolate China, but instead, dependence actually grew.
America assumes the world would naturally isolate China over time, systematically moving manufacturing back home or over to allied nations. Instead, global dependence grew. Today, China heavily dominates absolutely vital industries, from the solar panels powering modern grids to high-capacity batteries, rare earth processing, and EV manufacturing. The real catch here? Even countries that are actively, aggressively trying to decouple find themselves entirely reliant on these exact Chinese supply chains just to function. You might buy an electronic device assembled in Mexico or Vietnam, sure, but the raw materials and the internal components, they almost certainly still originated in China.
To really understand why this is happening, the data suggests we need to redefine a crucial term for this new era: infrastructure. Traditionally, we just think of infrastructure strictly as roads, bridges, and power lines, right? But in the 21st century, infrastructure represents the foundational systems of the global economy. It's evolved far beyond physical structures to include critical underlying supply chains, raw material processing capabilities, and vital technological components. And this perfectly defines the paradox. The harder the world tries to untangle and decouple from China, the more difficult, expensive, and near impossible it actually becomes.
And the reason it's so difficult is pretty profound. When you really look at it, China is no longer just another economy. It literally became infrastructure. Let's move to our final section, Section 5, the future economic war. Who controls the future? Let's see how this conflict is escalating into something far more dangerous.
This conflict has evolved way beyond basic consumer goods or who can manufacture the cheapest plastic toys. It is now a high-stakes battle for absolute command over the technologies of tomorrow. The new battlegrounds are clearly drawn for us: artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, green energy dominance, and centralized digital currencies. These aren't just lucrative industries. They are the fundamental building blocks of future national security. Honestly, whoever commands these sectors dictates the entire trajectory of the 21st century.
Now, the sources show that America's counter strategy involves massive, multi-billion-dollar initiatives to basically rebuild domestic manufacturing from the ground up, strictly restrict advanced chips from ever reaching Chinese markets, and actively reduce general dependency on Chinese industry. However, we have to acknowledge the harsh reality of time here. Rebuilding sweeping industrial power, like constructing a cutting-edge semiconductor fab, takes years, sometimes decades. Meanwhile, China is already operating with massive entrenched momentum.
So what started as a trade war in 2018 was supposed to slow China down. Instead, the analysis indicates it may have simply accelerated the rise of a highly resilient, globally integrated superpower and ushered in a dangerous new era. An era not defined by post-Cold War peace or seamless globalization, but by economic warfare. It's silent, it's highly strategic, and it is entirely relentless. The global economy is no longer just a shared marketplace. It's acting as the battlefield itself.
And so as we look at this vast, interconnected web of unbreakable supply chains, the race for future technology, and the sheer scale of global leverage, the real question is no longer whether China can challenge America. The real question is, what happens if it already has?